Hey everybody, today I'm going to be talking about 10 things I'm loving in books right now. I made a list like this a couple of years ago, and I've always meant to make an updated list because I'm always noticing new things I'm loving in books. I think making lists like this is a good way to track what you're gravitating towards in books, and it's also a good way to notice ways in which your reading taste changes over time. So I do intend to make these now and then. And as with everything on this list, it all boils down to execution and setup, and sometimes it can work in a book, sometimes it doesn't work in a book. So, keeping that in mind, I will talk about examples in which I think these things were done well. My first item is when the memory of a character looms large in a story. And an example I can give is in Rebecca by Du Maurier. We never meet the character Rebecca in this story. She is dead before the book even begins. We are following the new wife of the Manderley estate who falls into her footsteps, marrying the widower. And yet she is obsessed. Our new bride, who is nameless in this story, is obsessed with how Rebecca would have been in this situation, what Rebecca was like, hearing stories about Rebecca. And the obsession is so real that you feel like Rebecca is there in the story. I loved the way this device was implemented in that book. And there are some really interesting twists and turns that happen in that book. But another way that this, I think, is used very well or effectively is in the A Song of Ice and Fire series by George R. R. Martin. There's a very prominent character who dies in book one, and the memory of this character lingers in the memories of his loved ones, his family members, and the ways that things he said echoes in their minds. I think it has impact, it has influence, and I loved seeing that ripple effect throughout those five books. And this doesn't have to be just with a character, it can happen with an event as well. And I think we see that in Malazan Book of the Fallen by Stephen Erickson. There are certain events that happen in books one and two, probably more books in the series, that echo throughout the entire series. And I think it's very powerful the way that's implemented, and it can work very well in a story that takes place over a long period of time. Next has to do with music. No one does it better than Guy Gabriel Kay did in A Song for Our Bone. That was my favorite book of last year and now one of my favorite books of all time. Music in that book impacts character motivation, the politics, the society in that story, or the two societies in different ways. One is against music, the other is for it, with troubadours. I have a spoiler free review if you want to learn more about that stuff. But I love that book. It is so powerful the way music is integrated again. But I also appreciate when an author can integrate music in other ways as well. So, another example that comes to mind is The Bone Clocks by David Mitchell. This book has a whole music playlist at the back of the book. And in that playlist, he mentions things such as Scarlatti and Benjamin Britten and Talking Heads. Not only that, but he also integrates music references throughout the story. So this takes place over several decades following different character journeys. And there are references to music such as Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, which is my favorite album of all time. And I think that that added a lot of cultural richness to the story, especially during those periods in history. So I thought it was so cool to see the way music was integrated in that way. I read Spear Cuts Through Water earlier this year by Simon Jimenez, and I understand through Evie that Simon Jimenez had a Spotify playlist to accompany that book. And I am all for authors having playlists with their books or having music influence their story in some way. I think that's a fantastic idea. The next set of things has to do with character dynamics. I love a good character focused story. It's not a requirement for me to enjoy a story. I've actually been able to enjoy stories that are not very character focused. But when they are character focused, there are certain things that I look for that I really appreciate. Now, this one that I'm going to talk about first, though, it won't work in every story, but I really love when I come across marital conflict at times. I know that's a strange one, but this is one that I noticed in Stephen King's Pet Cemetery last year. There is a marital conflict that happens at the beginning of the book with the couple that are fighting over how to discuss death to their daughter. Now, keep in mind, when I say marital conflict, I'm not talking about physical abuse. I don't care to read about that personally. I am talking about arguments, not seeing eye to eye. And so I really appreciated the way this was displayed in that book because the husband was coming at the subject from a very matter of fact, logical perspective. The wife, on the other hand, was coming at the situation from a very emotional perspective. She had past events that were influencing the way she saw this subject, and you learn about that later on. But it was very clear reading this argument that they weren't going to see eye to eye, that they were coming at this subject from very different perspectives, and it escalated. And the language that was used, every way that argument escalated, just worked for me. Another example that comes to mind, though, is War Host of Vastmark, which is book 3 in Wars of Light and Shadow by Jenny Wirtz. There is a marital conflict in that book that was set up so well. And what was impactful about it is that there was supposed to be this blissful reunion between husband and wife, and things go sour. Now, what I loved about that whole scene is not only how things transform on the page, but I felt like I could almost visualize the scene as being a scene of an opera. I could imagine the music accompanying that scene and the different types of dissonance that would occur and modulations that would suddenly be inserted. It just felt so musical to me in that way, and I loved it. The next item on my list has to do with friendship conflict. This is especially true in fantasy, where we see a lot of found families happen, and you have characters who go on long journeys together, they spend all night and day together, and to me, it only makes sense that there is going to be conflict at certain points. There are going to be disagreements. It doesn't have to mean that they're necessarily opposed to the mission. They might have differences of opinion about how to go about the mission, but I think that's realistic. Things are going to come up, and I loved how this was integrated in the Gentleman Bastard series when I read Republic of Thieves last year, book 3 in that series. If you love the Gentleman Bastards, chances are you love the friendship between Locke and Jean, as I do. I love that they had a certain conflict at the beginning of that book, and the conflict was not rooted in being against each other. It was because they cared about each other, and that's the important thing. Sometimes we have conflict because we care about each other. And it's the ways in which we work through those conflicts that is meaningful, that deepens the friendship. And in this case, I think it added so much depth to that friendship or reflected the depth of the friendship. So I am all for good conflict in friendship, in fantasy especially. The next item is a bit controversial and it has to do with love triangles. I did a whole video about this. I don't mind an overt love triangle. But these days, rather than the angsty triangles that we see often in YA literature or romance fiction, which is perfectly fine if you enjoy that, but what I tend to enjoy these days is when a love triangle occurs in the story, but it's very blended into the story. It's blended into the themes, it's blended into the bigger things that are happening in the story. And sometimes you might not even notice the love triangle. So that's what I talked about in that particular video, which you can check out if you want to learn more. But I mentioned series such as Long Price Quartet, the Prince of Nothing trilogy, as well as Guns of the Dawn, The Lions of Alrasan, several books that you probably wouldn't even think about if you were considering the love triangle. Next on my list, tonal contrasts. And this could be between two characters or multiple characters, or it could be with a single character on the page. I thought this was done very effectively with multiple characters on the page in Abercrombie's Age of Madness trilogy. I noticed that characters contrasted each other in a very lively, entertaining way. An example might be a character going into an establishment looking for someone, bumping into another character, hey, watch out. And there's just this friction that immediately happens. It's very lively, very entertaining in the way Abercrombie writes it, not in the way I'm explaining it. But I think this can also be done in a more toned down way or in a more serious way. And so an example that comes to mind is the prologue of Tigana. I just finished this book, that's why it's fresh in my mind. In this prologue, we have a prince and his friend. They're losing a war, and the prince is feeling very melancholy, very regretful, very sad about this. And his friend is trying to remind him to be hopeful, to have pride, to believe in what they are doing for future generations. And I don't know, there's an interesting subtle dance between what they're feeling and the ways they're connecting on the page. The prince kind of resistant towards this pride, resistant towards this hope, and at the same time loving his friend, and his friend trying to trying to hold on to the belief for himself, if not for his prince. I thought it was such a beautiful exchange and it pulled me into the story. A Song of Ice and Fire has so many examples of this. I noticed this especially when I talked through a Catelyn Stark chapter over on Bend the Knee with Jimmy. He's a co host of that podcast, which is all about A Song of Ice and Fire. And when I was reading that chapter again, I couldn't help but notice the ways in which Catelyn Stark was experiencing worry and stress and fear, and then hope and anticipation. And there was just a constant contrast of emotions happening on the page with one thought flowing right into the next. It's something that keeps you engaged and deepens a character experience. Another thing I love in books is when a character has a revelation or an epiphany. This happens in Stoner by John Williams. At the very beginning of the book, Stoner has a revelation that he's in love with literature. Actually, his professor has to reveal that back to him. But once he realizes this, the whole world seems to open up to him. And Stoner has another revelation or a couple of other revelations throughout the book. And I loved those moments. And they don't have to be big, loud moments. They could be in the most mundane of circumstances when a character has a moment where they realize something and it changes the course of their life. This also happens in Ascension by McKinds. The character, who's a microbiologist, is undergoing a very stressful circumstance with a very abusive father, and she's come to a moment where she's realized she's helpless. She wants to escape, realizes she can't, and she goes into the ocean and has this revelation. She has an epiphany that changes the whole course of her life. And the way that was written pulled me into the story, and I thought it had a wonderful echo throughout the rest of the story. The next one is when a character seems to be a product of the society in which they are brought up in. So, an example is in The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin, first book I finished this year. Shevik feels like the direct result of the society where he was brought up. It feels very believable to me that he has the beliefs he has based on the societal mindset that he was brought up in, based on all the influences around him. And that also leads to a lot of conflict for him as well. But I also think this was brought forth really well in The Bone Clocks, once again, by David Mitchell, because the characters in this book throughout the different decades, they seem to represent the culture at the time, their socioeconomic status, the locations in which they are born, their family members. All those things inform their identities. And at the same time, they felt like real people. They felt like they would be distinct even among people who had the same circumstances as they did. And I don't know how Mitchell pulled that off. It was really amazing the way these characters just came alive in that sense. Another author who I think does this very well is Stephen King. I noticed this in the Dark Tower series, the characters who come from different time periods, different worlds perhaps, and yet they interacted in such a believable way. The next one is when the writing style is reflective of the character psychology. And this is a little bit of a cheat because I did talk about one in my last list about how the setting reflected the character psychology. And in this instance, I'm mostly talking about the writing style and the character psychology. So an example is Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. The character, Charlie Gordon, has a very low IQ. He undergoes a surgery to rapidly increase his IQ, and the writing style reflects that as it is in first person narration in an epistolary format. So at the beginning of the book, you'll notice grammatical errors, you'll notice very simple sentences, and then as you go on in the story, as his IQ increases, you'll notice that his sentences become more complex, his writing improves, his critical thinking skills emerge, his complexity of thought really starts to show on the page. And I thought that made the story all the more powerful. I also noticed this in The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin again. I noticed this thanks to Alan because we were buddy reading the book. He was ranting about a passage on a live show. And what was funny about that is that Jimmy, who wasn't reading the book, happened to point out what he thought Le Guin was doing in that passage. And not only was Jimmy right, but it also got me to think about why she was doing that and how that was reflective of the character's psychology and his experience in that moment. And then later on, Alan also sent me another passage, and I thought she did the same thing. She was, in her own subtle way, reflecting the character's experience. And the fact that I didn't even really notice it when I was reading it. I noticed it when I looked back, made me appreciate it even more. The way that she was able to change her writing style in a very subtle way, or at least I thought it was subtle. It was probably obvious to some people, but I just think it was really clever to be able to do that. So I appreciate if an author is able to transform their writing style, especially because most of us aren't going to have consistent experiences all the time. We're going to feel differently in one situation versus another. So why wouldn't the writing style reflect that? Last thing I'm loving in books, consciousness explorations. And unlike human consciousness, where we're writing about the human experience and reflecting that through the writing style or any of the other things I'm talking about in this particular video, I also really enjoy the exploration of non human consciousness. And the example that comes to mind is Solaris by Stanislaw Lem. And in this particular book, we have a whole planet that is conscious, but it's not conscious in the same ways that humans are conscious. And the humans who are there on the planet are trying to understand how the planet is thinking and how it may or may not be communicating, if it has an agenda or not. I found it so interesting, especially the ways in which we humans tend to anthropomorphize consciousness. And obviously, it's really hard as an author to try to explore beyond that because authors are human, readers are human, but it's still fun to try. This was also in part explored in Grand Conspiracy by Janie Wirtz. I recently hosted a discussion here with a critical dragon and Philip Chase, and we talked about one particular scene in which the life on this planet was conscious in a different way and not in a human way. So I just find that so much fun in books. I find it so fascinating to explore those questions or to explore consciousness in books. And I intend to read more books about that particular topic in the future. That is it. That is my list of 10 things I'm loving in books right now. Please let me know if you have any recommendations based on the items I mentioned. No guarantee I will love the book, but there's a good chance. You never know. And please let me know in the comment section things you're loving in books right now. Thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of your day. Bye bye.